สวัสดีครับ Hello and good afternoon to dear member of IOD. I am the CEO of Thai IOD, Kulvech Janvatanavit. And once again, welcome to the director briefing. This time, many thanks to McKinsey and Company, we are going to talk about how boards have risen to COVID's challenge and what's next. As we know that this COVID has transformed the battlefield of business into that unthinkable arena, and each business has to change, and the board cannot sit in the back seat of the car or the bus. Sometimes the board has to do something that is meaningful to the future and the sustainability of the organization. So that is what we're going to be discussing today, but the highlight is also the speaker. The speaker, his name, I hope I get it right, okay? Frithjof, Lund, from McKinsey, and you're based in Oslo. And you know what? He is the founder of board service for McKinsey. So if we have to ask someone from McKinsey what board should do right now, ask him. Okay. So before we go into and listen to him, some administrative first. All of you will be put on mute, but if you want to ask some question, please feel free to go to chat and then go to all panelists. Okay. Okay. So without any further ado, this session is going to take 1 hour exactly. And the first 20 minutes is going to be about Frithjof talking about what does he mean by board that has to get the company to go beyond COVID-19, repositioning themselves in the new normal. Hello. Hello, Mr. Frithjof.
Yes, hi.
Hi, how are you?
Perfect. I'm good, thank you. And thank you for inviting me.
Before we talk about this topic, can you talk a little bit about board service of McKinsey? What does it mean?
Yes, very happy to do that. And hello to everyone. And again, thank you for inviting McKinsey and myself to speak to you today. As Kulvech mentioned, I'm a senior partner in McKinsey. I have been part of building up what we call McKinsey Board Services, which is basically our corporate governance leg in McKinsey globally. I've done that with a couple of colleagues over the last 10 to 15 years. What we do is advising both owners, boards of directors, and also the management team in terms of how to create a value enhancing dynamic with the board of directors. So all three key constituencies in the corporate governance framework, so to speak. Do you want me, Kulvech, should I give a little bit of context for what we will speak about and then go into some of the contents?
Go ahead, please.
Fantastic. So I was asked by Kulvech and the team to share some of our perspectives on how have boards developed during the pandemic, and what do we expect to connect after the pandemic. And this is based both on our discussions with chairs and board directors and CEOs across the globe over the last 18 to 24 months, and of course also based on our recent board surveys that we are doing frequently globally. And we published a few articles about that I'm sure that you can share with the participants if anyone wants to go a little bit deeper on that. They are published on McKinsey Quarterly or McKinsey Insights. Maybe one comment on the fact base for the ones wondering. We have been running, I think, the largest global board survey for almost 20 years now. We have been running that every second year. But then during the pandemic, we ran one in 2019, and then the pandemic hit us. And we wanted to understand how has that affected how boards operate, and again, how are the expectations changing? So we ran one last fall, and some of these insights are based also on those or on that survey. And overall, if I'm to give the helicopter view on what at least we observe has happened over the last, let's say, 18 months, it is really not any completely new trends. This is more, as we have seen a lot during the pandemic, it's about acceleration of pre-existing trends, which were present for boards of directors already before COVID, but that has been accelerated over the last 12 to 18 months. And this is, of course, what we have also observed when it comes to digitization or consumer preferences or the focus on energy transition. These have been present, but they have been further accelerated during the crisis. And I'll go a bit deeper into why that is. And let me perhaps start by taking one big step back and look at what were the broader trends before the pandemic hit us. And this is our standard almost framework for explaining some of the broad development for the boards, the expectations to the board of directors over the last, I would say, 2 decades. And the broad movement, as I'm sure you are all aware of, and I think maybe even you have discussed this in a previous session, there has been a movement from what you could say the more complacent or with maybe a worse expression, the rubber stamping board. So on the very left-hand side here, towards what we call the value enhancing board over the last 5+ years or so. Now, this is a massive simplification, just to be clear. You had value enhancing boards 20, 30 years ago, and you still have many complacent boards in 2020. So this is a simplification. And of course, it does differ a bit by region and geography. At the same time, the trend is consistent globally, irrespective of governance system. And some of the triggers, as we have tried to illustrate with the pictures here, some of the triggers has been some of the larger corporate governance crisis, you could say, globally. There was a big step change, as many of you might remember, after Parmalat, Enron, WorldCom, you had some corporate crisis in the early 2000s. This is when we got Sarbanes-Oxley regulation in the US. A lot of the corporate governance codes globally came around the early 2000s. That was an increased focus on compliance and fiduciary duties. Then you had a second, you could say, step change in the aftermath of the financial crisis, when boards were expected not only to be compliant and to ensure compliance, but also to really understand what was going on in the company at a deeper level. And then you had over the last, which we illustrate with, I think it's a picture from Toys R Us, which was a company going bankrupt due to inability to cope with some of the, let's say, disruptive online sales challenges. You had a period where boards were increasingly being expected to really help management maneuver around the next corners and understand what was going to hit us. And then if we go to, and that was the foundation for what we call in McKinsey the value enhancing board, the expectation that the board not only does the compliance and the fiduciary duties, but really helps strategically the management and the company navigate through the disruptive landscape that we see. And what we have seen, maybe if I were to say that in one expression, if you go to the next one that shows maybe the next or the final curve, is what we call the catalyst board or the champions of change, which is really going not only being value enhancing, but actually helping catalyze some of the changes required in the current context. It will be for many companies, or for all companies, it can be around the energy transition. That is one, but it's really also reinventing the business models, which again has been, I would say, accelerated during also the pandemic. If you look at the amount of reinvention also for large incumbent companies, that is really what we see. And more boards are taking that role in really helping management to really catalyze a new expectation level or a new ambition level for the companies strategically. Let's maybe then, with this as a backdrop, this is the very broad picture. If we then go to the next page and we take a bit of a closer look, what really happened during the pandemic, let me highlight a few elements that we'll spend a bit of time on in the next 10 minutes. I think one key area, in generally, we would say that boards and management just collaborated a lot closer. So we saw a pretty drastically increased level of collaboration. Some board chairs and CEOs refer to it almost as becoming one team to a much larger extent than before. The second factor we saw was that board directors have spent significantly more time on the board work. The third change was more around the agenda of the board, where especially the topic of resilience, not surprisingly, became a lot higher on the agenda. And then finally, we saw boards and board directors quite significantly changing the operating model of their boards and implementing quite a few new processes in how they ran the board meetings and the dynamics with management. Let me dive a little bit deeper into each of these points. And if we start with collaboration between the board and the management team. Now, this was, as mentioned, one of the most common changes made during the crisis. It was really better discussions and collaboration between the board and the management team. And almost 80%, 79% of our respondents across the board in the latest board survey say that this collaboration has been effective or very effective during the pandemic, which is significantly up. It's almost 20 percentage points up from 2019, so pre-pandemic. It is a clear shift in terms of collaboration. What this chart shows is that the improved collaboration also seems to correlate with a better and or more effective COVID-19 response. So the strengthened collaboration seems to help companies navigate, or have helped companies navigate, the pandemic even better. What you see here on the left-hand side is that more than 90% of the respondents really reporting an effective collaboration between the board and management also say that their board's response to the crisis was effective. And this is compared to only 60% of all other respondents. So it seems to be a strong, let's say, correlation between collaboration and effective navigation of the crisis, which is just an important learning to take with us, as many companies will focus on resilience also going forward. If we then move towards the time spent, and here, Kulvech, I think we wanted to run a little poll just to get a feeling for the participants and how that has affected the boards in Thailand. Should we try to get the responses to that?
Oh, yes, please go ahead. So we are going to do the poll right now, right?
Yes.
So the question is, how many days per year does your board devote to its role? You mean when you say its role, you mean role as a what?
Yeah. So this is for board directors. How much time, including preparations, reading material, and for the actual board discussions, approximately how many days in a year do you dedicate to the role as either a chair or a board director on one particular board, just to get the feeling for the status of the time spent in companies in Thailand.
Okay, so we have 6 choices. Please go ahead. I hope there's not much of A.
And we will compare that just to my next chart afterwards to see how that compares to the global sample.
And what I would be interested is before and after COVID, is the number of days rising?
And the short answer is yes. But let's. When do we get results, or do we maybe close it now? And can we see the results for everyone?
Yep. Can we wait a little bit?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. But what we can do is maybe I can show the results at least from our global survey, and then we can go back to maybe the results locally. So this is how on average the time is spent shifted both pre-pandemic and the expectations also going forward for boards. And in this is actually based on a split of the respondents, but on average, board members in the survey state that they increased time spent by 20% on each individual board in 2020, again measured in number of days of board work, including the committee meeting, preparations, capability building, etc., from approximately 27 to 32 days a year. And on average, they expect to spend even more time in this year, in 2021. Now, interestingly, what this chart shows is when we look at the board members who scored their boards highest on how well they had helped the organization respond to the crisis, which is the dark blue at the top here, we see that the differences are even greater. So the board directors who report to be more effective at helping navigate the crisis have spent disproportionately more time, basically. And not only did they spend more time before the pandemic hit, but they also reported a significantly higher increase than all others, both in 2020 and then, as you see to the far right, in the expectations for 2021. And I think this is, again, what we have seen as a development over the last 10 years. And this is really a result of the increased expectations from stakeholders, which are increasing on multiple arenas for board directors to be engaged in. Now I'm really curious to look at, I think we see the results here, where it seems to be spread out, but largely in the, I would say, 10 to 15 and 16 to 20 days, and then somewhat lower. And help me here, Kulvech, I don't see a lot of details on the results, but it seems to be centered a little bit towards the lower end in Thailand on in terms of how much time the boards represented on this call spent. Does that resonate for you, Kulvech?
No, I think that the number of people who fill this form is too few to kind of indicate the whole big picture. But I would assume that right now there's a lot of board that we have seen that that has at least once a month board meeting, especially with the big board like Thai banks, once a month, not including subcommittee.
Yes.
So you know, we are saying that we have seen significantly increase of how the board spend their time talking, and this is only about the formal board meeting, including preparation, but did not talk about all this research that they have to do on their own, talk to the peers, talk to the chairman, on the, you know, that is something that is significant too.
Yes, and I think that resonates, and we don't fully see it in the results here, but as you say, I think that is really what we see in all geographies, consistent, and again, irrespective of the fundamental governance system, which will be different in the US and in different European countries and in Asia, and I'm sure in Thailand. So, but still, we do see on average that the intensity and the frequency of board meetings and committee meetings, of course, exploded for most companies during the crisis. But again, it hit very differently depending on how challenged the industry. Let me maybe move towards how the board agenda developed a bit. If we flip to the next page, I think compared to before the pandemic, the broad topics on the board agenda are still the same. It's innovation and growth and technological trends still. Again, this is globally, so it might be different locally, but we still see innovation and growth and technological trends quite high on the agenda. Now, one main shift, we click to the next just to see the shift here maybe. If there is the beautiful line between the columns here, we saw one significant shift, which is not surprising, but that corporate resilience really lifted almost to the second most important topic on the agenda. Now, this will surprise none of you after what we've been through. At the same time, it's interesting to note that when we asked the 1,000 board directors in 2019, only 20% believed that corporate resilience was a significant challenge. A very low percent actually thought that the board was well prepared to deal effectively with major crises. So there seems to have been a real lack of, let's say, attention and preparation for corporate resilience pre the pandemic, which has, of course, now taken a completely different, let's say, space in the board agenda. We also did observe that some of the topics around people and organization, which has been elevated over the last years, they seem to have gone down, as illustrated by culture here. But we do believe that that is more to refocus time on resilience and not a lasting development. So most, and we also saw that in the survey result, that most of the board directors believe that they will purpose, culture, talent will continue to be more important again going forward.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I was wondering, how do you classify corporate resilience? And you just mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, we classify that as really the ability to withstand larger crises, but that can be externally induced, like the pandemic or larger geopolitical shocks, but it can also be induced by an internal event or by being disrupted by other players, which is what we also see. So it's really the ability to withstand, let's say, larger shocks that happens to the organization. If that makes sense. And I'm happy to go a bit deeper into in the Q&A in some of the.
Okay.
Let's maybe move towards, I mean, getting towards some of the very busy slides. And sorry for the tiny text here. I hope that you can read it. If not, I mean, we're also happy to share the materials, etc. afterwards. We wanted to get it all on one page just to show what were some of the changes made that boards made during the pandemic. And the first thing we noticed here is that most or almost all boards changed parts of their operating models in how they operated. On average, based on our different alternatives, we saw that each board on average made 4 changes, which is quite a lot in a short amount of time. And the most common changes were around either more structural or process-related changing. That was, as you see towards the top here, investing in technology and tools to interact more digitally. It was establishing, as you also mentioned, Kulvech, the ad hoc crisis management committees or committees to deal with the immediate crisis, or just increasing the frequency of board meetings, both the regular ones, but also the ad hoc board meetings in between and the dialogue in between meetings. Now, this is followed by changes in how the board and management work together, and also the flexibility around the topics on the board agenda. And what surprised us, quite frankly, a bit was that the least common changes were related to composition of the board. And you could say that is maybe not that surprising, given that this is more time consuming, it requires approval from shareholders, etc. At the same time, we do believe that this might be one of the interesting implications of the increased, let's say, remote collaboration and with the hybrid meetings going forward, that it releases some of the almost geographical constraints that you have had for in-person board meetings. Again, as you mentioned initially, Kulvech, I'm from Norway. I'm based in Oslo. That's a small country far north in Europe, but we have some very global companies. But for us to get board directors from Asia or from the US West Coast, that has often been a challenge, because the expectation would be in Norway, on average, it's 10 to 12 board meetings per year. As in Thailand, it's once per month. But getting people to fly from Asia or West Coast US to tiny Norway is challenging. We believe, and in my discussions also here locally, I hear a lot more openness to maybe have 2 or 4 in-person board meetings and the rest of the board meetings run by video. And I think for many countries, this will represent an opportunity to increase diversity on the board. And with diversity, I mean that in a broad sense, with diversity of skills and capabilities into the board, which are matched with the strategy of the companies. So these are some of the changes. Maybe also one comment on the board, the flexibility of the board agendas, which is one of the points here. Here we see two things, both that strategy is becoming even more central. It has been becoming more central over the last 2 decades, but it's becoming even more central as a continuous theme at every single board meeting. So this represents much more agility in the actual strategy process, that most or many companies are moving beyond this once in a year, 2-day annual strategy offsite. They still do that as a deep dive, but strategy becomes a topic at every single board meeting. And this is again an acceleration of a trend that was existing before the pandemic, but which has been pressure tested and really put in place for many more companies during the pandemic. And the second element is really just more flexibility in the actual agenda setting for the board meetings, because as we saw in the pandemic, you needed to adapt to the context much more continuously, and that required somewhat more flexibility in the actual agendas. I think if we just quickly look at the next one, I think we need to open soon for Q&A, but we also looked at what we call the most adaptable boards, which we thought was interesting, and we defined the most adaptable boards as those who had made at least one change in structure, process, and collaboration, and who also claimed to be best at helping their organizations deal with the crisis. And interestingly, and this is represented here with the dark blue for each of the same elements we saw on the previous page. What we saw was that on average, the most adaptable boards, they made twice as many changes as everyone else. So it's really, they were much more prone to make adaptations in how they operated. And we saw the largest differences actually in this cooperation and collaboration between the board and the management, and also within the board. And as I showed on the previous page, they spent 50% more time in 2020 than anyone else, than any other boards. So there seems to be what we sometimes call a bifurcation, where the most adaptable, they just do a lot more. And here I also think we were considering, before we now go to the final point, which is what will happen ahead. If we look to the future, we wanted to do one more poll. Should we try that, Kulvech? We wanted to ask you which changes to the board's way of working in light of what you just saw. What do you expect locally are most likely to remain over the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years? And this can be, as you see the alternatives here, we just chose some of the elements, given we cannot take all of them. Is it running at least some board meetings remotely? Is it increasing the use of technology and digital tools to collaborate? This can be online cloud-based platforms for sharing board materials. Many of you are probably doing that already. Is it improving the board processes, more frequent updates, shorter monthly reports, etc., including strategy, as we mentioned, on every single board meeting agenda? Is it more frequent interactions also between the board and the senior management team? Or is it in general just increased flexibility in the board's agenda? Again, being able to deviate from the board's annual calendar to address critical issues as they arise. So it could be useful. Maybe we do as the last time, in the interest of time, we take the last slide and then we can revisit what the answers were.
Sure, yeah, because the time is running out. So
Yes, exactly. So this is the last one, which is if we look ahead, what is it that we see? In general, we see that the vast majority of both the response to our survey, but this corresponds very well to our discussions with several hundred chairs and board directors around the globe. We see that the vast majority will continue to run at least some of the board meetings remotely. This depends a lot on the individual company, I would say, and also the country context. We see a much more expectation to use digital collaboration tools, and we see a remaining closer collaboration between the board and the management, with a higher frequency of updates and dialogue between the board meetings, shorter reports, etc., as well as strategy discussions in all board meetings. And also here, as is indicated by the two colors here, we see that the most adaptable boards, the ones who were able to navigate or help their organizations navigate the crisis the best, they are also the ones who expect to continue with far more changes than all the other boards in our survey. So if you're a participant here and you want to be amongst at least what we call the most adaptable boards, you should prepare to make some of the changes you have made in your operating models more permanent as you go forward. And I think here we also see we have a fairly even spread. It's interesting, even if it's a small sample, Kulvech, I think still it's interesting to see that most of these elements, some of the participants believe will remain. So both running some of the interactions remotely, increased use of technology, etc., will also be relevant locally for the boards in Thailand. I think maybe with that we can open for Q&A. I realize the polls took a bit more time from our original.
Thank you very much, Frithjof. So let me summarize what you just said. I think the the development of how the board contribute, or the board style in the past 3-4 decades has changed. But the whole thing about COVID is that the holy grail is not to change the board itself, because it takes like an AGM, and it's too much of an effort within a short time. But more about how to make the best out of what we have, which is this board and this management. How can we work together more effectively, right? Is that yes. And maybe using technology to enhance that, right?
Yes, I think that's a good summary.
Okay, but when we say, if effective collaboration, what does it mean by that? You talk about spending time more between boards and management, but what are they talking about? What does the board, beside the time, what actually the board has to do with the management to make that effective a board?
I think there are a number of topics, and I'm sure there is a lot of experience of the participants on this call. So many will have experienced that, I assume. Especially, I would say, strategy, involvement of the board in the fundamental strategy process. That is one of the developments, again, very present over the last 10 years or more, 2 decades, I'd say, but accelerating importance over the last 10 years, maybe, which again now has become almost an imperative that the board needs to not only be involved to provide the stamp of approval on a strategy that is fully developed by the management, but that the board wants to be and is expected by the other stakeholders, by owners, investors, other constituencies, to also be involved in the development phase. So already from understanding what are the trends hitting us, involved very early in the process, understanding the major trends and developments, and then understanding what are some of the strategic alternatives, not only getting one proposal from management, but seeing what are some of the alternatives and being involved in those discussions. I think that is one, and again, having strategy much less as now we make a 3-year strategy and we execute on that, and we speak, once a year at strategy offsite and we check off how we are doing, but much more of a continuous process. But we also see, that strategy, we also see, which is very closely integrated with the resilience discussion, is really risk. And understanding risk not only as the external or geopolitical shocks, but really understanding sustainability, both as the risk and an opportunity. What are the regulatory developments driven by the sustainability agenda that can materially negatively affect us? And if you flip that around, what opportunities does that represent? That will be a major discussion. It's also topics like talent, organization, and culture, which is really where we have seen a development also pre-COVID for many years, where boards are increasingly expected to not have a point of view on whether it's person A or person B in the corporate management team, because that is the CEO and the management responsibility. However, the board is increasingly expected to ensure that the company has the talent bench in general, which is strong enough, and that they have the robust processes for ensuring that they have the right talent in the, let's say, in the right role for the most value-creating initiatives or business units. So it's really much more deeper engagement around talent and also on culture, right? Of many of the corporate scandals that we've seen over the last, it was out from Covid-19 in Japan, or Volkswagen in Europe, or Wells Fargo in the US in banking. It's corporate crisis induced by cultural, you could say, deficits, which ultimately the board needs to engage on and role model.
Yep. Okay, so what you're saying is that the level of interaction between the board and the management is deeper.
Yes.
Right? You said that the board has to. I recall one of the previous director briefing, someone used the word zoom out. The board has to get the management to look outside their own boundary and look at the whole world, the stakeholders, the trend, how it's going to impact them, and then zoom in, which is organization readiness, the culture, even C-suite succession planning, not only CEO, compensation, architect, to do something that will prevent us from being like a Wells Fargo. But at the same time, be mindful of the stakeholder, not to be like what Exxon Mobil is right now facing with Engine One, right? So it's like outside and inside.
I think that is a very good way to put it, actually. And I think this notion, maybe to be, I opened with this chart that showed the catalyst board at the end. I actually think that is where we are heading. And many of my clients, I serve clients in the energy and basic material space, but also in the telecom space and logistics space. And I see the importance of the board helping really this, and we call it catalyzing, because it's really, you need to raise the ambition level to understand if you're in the logistics. I serve a incumbent postal operator that is challenged by Amazon. You will need to fundamentally think differently about your business and your business model to meet some of the global competition coming. If you are in oil and gas or in aluminum or in fertilizers, which are, some of the clients I serve, you need to fundamentally think differently about, the energy transition and how you're going to cope with that if you're a large natural gas user, etc. And I think in order to do that effectively, the board needs to be sort of a catalyst mechanism for that, which is because it's very hard. The management has very often grown up with 30, maybe more years in that company, and you need a bit of an external force to pull you out of the gravity around the company in terms of the strategic thinking.
Board has to act like a sandbox for management to understand the outside world in future, both the trend and the stakeholders, right?
Yes.
Okay. There is a question from the audience, which is, how has ESG and sustainability expectations from the board changed during the pandemic, if any?
Yes, sorry, I'm trying to find.
How has the ESG and sustainability expectation? I think I'm not sure it's from the board or to the board. Changed during the pandemic. Yep.
Yeah, here I would say this is again an example of a trend that was already, existing way before the pandemic. We have had an ESG, increasing focus on ESG for, of course, a number of years. It's not, that many years, but at least it has increased also pre-COVID. I think what we have seen has been accelerated during the pandemic, but not necessarily due to the pandemic, just to be clear on that. But we have seen a massive acceleration that is really driven, I would say, in Europe, that's driven by the EU and the EU taxonomy, for the ones familiar with that, and the whole financial market. Globally, it's really driven by the financial markets and the main players and the BlackRock and even the Norwegian oil fund, which I'm close to. So I would say that has really impacted the agenda, that there is no single industry and no single board of directors that can not be discussing ESG currently, and I believe there are a few, because that is what I think is one critical element that many boards actually and many management teams also lack, is a real deep understanding of what are the implications for us, both on the risk side, but also on the opportunity side. And this is again where we believe that the board can play a catalyst role, is shaping, both understanding the risk that is linked to resilience, but it's also being able to, let's say, catalyze the change on the opportunities. Again, I see some in some industries where there are vast opportunities, but they will require something quite different in terms of the speed of how companies are going after those opportunities, and also, quite frankly, even the culture, so the risk culture. If you're moving from being a very stable, let's say, energy and basics materials player, and you're supposed to go for green hydrogen in a very competitive market.
Yeah, so you're saying that ESG, is coming anyway, but pandemic just is like a time machine. Is just fast forward our future, ourselves into that 10 years from now, where at the time the implication on ESG would have been much deeper on your organization, but it's today, right now.
Yes, I think there's a very good question here in the chat of how the board can be involved in strategy without trespassing the boundaries. Which I think is a very good one. And I think this is where many boards, and I think many boards and management team currently are, quite frankly, struggling a bit. I see a lot of sensitivity in exactly that discussion. How far should the board be involved? I think we believe that the board, as a minimum, needs to be involved in how to frame the strategy process as such. That is actually also a board responsibility in many jurisdictions. This differs a bit how it's in the legal framework in each country, but I would say it's a converging view globally that the board should, as a minimum, be involved in setting the expectations to the strategy process, the expectation for, let's say, radicality of solutions, and also on the ambition, and also actually how the strategy process is set up. I think the board then needs to be, and this is again the increasing expectation by both the board but also the owners, is that the board is involved much more continuously in understanding and discussing, as I mentioned, the alternative. And I think this is not necessarily being the one, let's say, to fully decide on all the details, but actually being able to discuss and be part of the decision on some of the major strategic alternatives.
Oh, Frithjof, okay, you said all about inspiration, how the board and the management should work together. But what stopped most of the board and management from doing that?
Yeah, that is a good question. If you mean what really stopped the board from being the, let's say, catalyzing entity, I would say there's a couple of things. One is actually a fundamental. First of all, I actually think the composition is very important for that discussion, because you cannot help catalyze change if you don't have a sufficiently deep understanding, not only of the company, but also of the opportunity around. As you say, the zoom out, you need to understand what are the trends. So there is a fundamental, let's say, capability and understanding requirement for the board to be a catalyst. And this is why we also see that many boards are spending a lot more time actually understanding trends and really affecting the board as such. I have one large oil and gas company that we work with that took the whole board of directors through a series of very deep trainings on offshore wind, green hydrogen, solar. They went through a lot of the, let's say, major new energy related opportunities, and they went really deep in the understanding. So I think you need that in order to really catalyze change. I think the second is you need trust. You need trust between the board and the management and the CEO and the chair specifically, because I have also seen if you have a very ambitious chair and board that wants to really change or raise the ambition level, but you have a CEO and a management team that really doesn't feel that the board adds enough value or has sufficient insight, you will get sensitivity. You will not get collaboration. So I think building the trust and earning the trust and having the right profiles for the board is a prerequisite to really help catalyze.
You know what? Okay, board composition, you said trust and everything. But everything comes back to, you know, the fact of life. We can't have the perfect board all the time, right? The perfect combination, the harmony or the utopia of the board and the management. But things are happening outside us. It's like when we zoom out, there's a lot of external factors. What is the role of the chairman in making the best out of what board already have? Okay, here we are. We have these 9 people, 9 directors. We can't change the directors. We have to do make the best out of them. We have to get them and the CEO and the management to work together. We have to create trust. We have to engage the board more and get them to be alert, to see the big picture, to know what we have to focus on, know what are the priority of our business and sustainability. Can you comment a little bit about the role of the chairman?
Yes. We fundamentally believe the role, not surprisingly, the role of the chairman is absolutely critical in this and has a lot of opportunity to actually influence this dynamic. I think there are a couple of key aspects. One is really actually the clarification of the role of the board. This is often a discussion that is being had explicitly between the board and the owners and the board and the management on the other side. So just being clear, what is it that you want, and that also aligning that with management and the CEO, what role should the board take? Are we going to be a fiduciary, more legacy type of board that is focusing on the fiduciary duties, or are we actually going to be a group of sparring partners who will help you navigate some of the challenging landscape that we're in? That is not. I saw a question here on the food initiative, which I also think is a good one, which is very often it's the owners who are now setting the expectations. We work a lot with private equity owners. I would actually say you can take quite a lot of inspiration from how many private equity players are thinking about the role of their board, where they are expecting their board to be much more engaged and active. In general, we see actually that board directors in private equity boards spend twice the amount of time as in publicly listed boards, which is again just a symptom. Of course, they will have different incentive mechanisms, etc. But that is again a symptom of the engagement and the level of, let's say, active intervention that you have in private equity. Now there are constraints, of course, for publicly listed companies, but I think there is quite a lot of learning to take from that. But again, so what is the role clarification that the chair needs to ensure? I think the second is being active in setting the annual agenda, which the board chair can do, capability building to really help build the capabilities of the board, and finally ensuring both a good dynamic internally, so you have trust internally in the company, in the board, to voice your opinions, and investing in the relationship with the CEO to create the trust between the board and the management.
Okay, we have some more questions from the audience, and these are 3 questions from the same person, and I try to put them as a one question, which is strategy is not the same as tactics. If strategy is now considered a process in between vision and tactics, tactic is like a execution. I would understand frequent intervention. Please kindly clarify how the board can avoid conflict of interfering with the management and being a supervising entity. So I guess yeah.
Yeah, I think I tried partially to respond to that earlier, because I think setting the framework for strategy and being part of evaluating alternatives does not mean that you are not a also supervising entity, but there is the question is very good, because this is a fine line to draw between the board suddenly taking over the strategy process and being the ones who are actually driving the strategy process. I personally, and we don't believe, I mean, this is still a management responsibility to develop and of course to execute the strategy. But again, the deeper involvement in strategy definition is something that is, we see that crystal clear across the globe in all jurisdictions, that the board is becoming a lot deeper involved. And quite frankly, it is really about also the supervisory element, because what we often have seen historically is that management will work on a corporate strategy maybe for half a year, maybe a year, without board involvement. They will have a large internal team. They will spend, maybe external consultants like us, they spend a lot of time on it. They anchor it with the full management, and then it comes to the strategy offsite, and the board gets 1 or maybe 10 days or 1 week or 2 weeks of a pre-read time with a 400-page document, and then you're expected as a board to say, you know, approve or disagree. It's a very hard, it's a very unfair balance, quite frankly, between the 1 year of anchoring and work, and the board who gets, you know, 1 week to prepare with a massive amount of information. So it's really trying to bridge that and having more continuous involvement. I would say that is.
Yeah, the borderline is becoming blur, but I always recall someone said that the best board know how to ask the right question, not to give the right answer.
Yes, I think that is a very good way to summarize.
So I'm just aware that we are a little bit over the date, the time. Maybe if there is one thing that you would like to be like a key takeaway for the audience, what would that be?
I think the one key takeaway is really the opportunity for all the board directors and chairs on this call. It's really the opportunity that I think many boards have to be a part of, again, catalyzing or helping lift the ambition levels for the companies in terms of how far you can reach and the pace, and taking that role. But that will, of course, require equivalently that you invest in the interaction. If you are a chair, investing in the relation, but also investing in the board as such on capabilities and dynamics and the annual agenda. So I think realize the opportunity that the board has to help navigate the entities and really invest in what is required to do that.
Many thanks, and I would like to summarize what I heard from your insights, your wisdom. Okay, you talked about the evolution of the board, and then the key thing is the effective collaboration between the board and the management, because you can't change the board tomorrow. You have to change the way the board interact with each other and work with the management. And pandemic even fast forward our board and our business to the future, and that where the ESG become more significant and amplified than today. So the future is here. So with that, trust is the commodity that has to be invested in the good time. It might be too late to establish trust in the bad time, because that's what you need most. So for those people, boards who maybe your key takeaway would be trust is the difference between the board who effectively work with the management, comparing with the board who cannot effectively work with the management, right? So with that, the board and the management can help each other zoom out and understand the trend, the stakeholders, and zoom in and understand the organizational culture, readiness and culture, and raise the bar together. You know what? I still have some other question. I wrote it down and I sent to you. It's like, how do you view the board of the future? But certainly not for this round. So perhaps maybe next time. Well, with that, I would like to thank McKinsey and for your, for your contributions in the past few years. And this speaker, Frithjof, I hope that we can meet again to discuss other aspects of the board, because it sounds like you have so much to share. I would like to thank all the members, and please, don't forget to do the evaluation on this QR code. We need to hear from you, your comment, your writing comment on how we could improve what you like and what you don't like. And thanks to Indorama for your support and making this session happen. Okay, so stay safe and good luck. And to Frithjof, good luck. And I heard it's summertime in Europe, so enjoy your summer.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Take care.
Okay, สวัสดีครับ บ๊ายบาย
Bye-bye.